Okay, in this brief little study on prayer, we have looked at the inward and the upward focuses of prayer. Tonight we'll look at the outward focuses of prayer. How our prayer life can impact others, how it can more deeply impact ourselves and those closest to us, and ultimately impact the kingdom of God. I want to begin by talking about something that Richard Foster refers to as praying the ordinary. He quotes one guy as saying, "Do not forget that the value and interest of life is not so much to do conspicuous things as to do ordinary things with perception of their enormous value." Too many people live their lives in a very segmented, pigeonholed, categorized kind of way. We have that part of our life that we refer to as family. And that's further subdivided into immediate nuclear family and extended family and the family that you only encounter maybe once every 10 or 20 years at a reunion. We have the category that we categorize as work. And for some that would be school. For others, moving into retirement, you've got other activities that are not family but fill some of those hours. Social clubs, I'm tomorrow at lunch I'll be at the Lions meeting. We've got those areas of our life. And then there is some place in there where we categorize spiritual things. And as one writer put it, we tend to live our lives with kind of an inner apartheid. We segregate a small corner for those pious activities like prayer and Bible study and going to church. And we keep it neatly contained so that it doesn't slop over into the other areas of our life. And so we commit what one writer described as the heresy of the 5% spirituality. That little box where we do those spiritual things, and all the rest of our life we pretty much live however we choose to. One way to try to overcome that 5% spiritual heresy is praying the ordinary. We do that in three ways. First, by turning ordinary experiences of life into prayer. Secondly, by seeing God in the ordinary experiences of life. And third, by praying throughout the ordinary experiences of life. The reality is, most of us, by the time we have been dead 50 years, will have been pretty effectively forgotten by this world. When I stop and think about my family ancestors, I know where my grandparents are buried. I know where most of my great-grandparents are buried. I know where a couple of my great-great-grandparents are buried. I know names as just simply names on a sheet of paper going back quite a few generations before that. But for most of those people, if I know anything about them other than name, date of birth, date of death, perhaps the state in which they're buried, it might be one little story that's been passed down from generation to generation. For all intents and purposes, those people are not only dead and buried, they're forgotten. Most of us will not be remembered by anybody 50 years from now. That's reality. Most of us don't do anything that is regarded as noteworthy enough to get into somebody's history book. We live our life like the vast majority of people. We're born, we grow up, we have a family, we watch the family move away, we grow old, we retire, we get increasingly feeble, and we die. We do our best in the course of that life to make the most of the moment. Most of us try reasonably hard to live a good life, to live a, quote, successful, unquote, life. But our days are filled with ordinary activity. You stop and think about the events of your life. You know, when I think about the big events in my life, you know, I think about some major moves that my parents made when I was a kid and moves that Joyce and I have made since we got married. I think about particularly the move when we moved out into the country to the little high school where Joyce was a student, you know, in my sophomore year, and how we started to date and got married. And, you know, the decision to go into the ministry, you know, the children we had, the places we lived, the people we knew. But there are huge blocks of time of which I have no real memory at all. They were just ordinary days. There are days from a month ago I have very little memory of, because nothing, quote, noteworthy, unquote, happened. It was just another day. The great lie that the devil has persuaded us to believe is that to have a significant spiritual life and a significant prayer life, your life needs to be filled with really noteworthy things that, you know, somebody might write a devotional book about. And the fact of the matter is, most of us don't have those moments, except very rarely, if at all. Most of our lives are filled with ordinary days, filled with ordinary events. And one of the secrets of having a vital spiritual life and a vital prayer life is to celebrate and make as an object of your prayer those ordinary events and those ordinary days. Because in a very real sense, there is nothing ordinary about anything. The Bible begins with the words, God created the heavens and the earth. And in just a few verses, he declared, it's good. So everything that we encounter is a part of God's good creation. Now, think about this. Creation itself was magnificent enough. But a couple thousand years ago, the eternal Son of God, who up until that moment was a pure spirit being, entered into that creation like an invader in what we call the incarnation. And in that process, for all of eternity, God had entered into his own creation in a way that was without precedent for all eternity past. And so now when we look upon creation, we look upon something that God not only created, but that he entered into and tied himself to permanently. When Jesus became a man, when he took on flesh and blood, that was a bridge that he burned behind him. It was for once and for all. He didn't cease to be a man when he was resurrected. He was resurrected into a body like the kind of body that you and I will have in the resurrection. It is, Paul calls it a spiritual body, not to give the idea that it is no longer physical, but it is of a new magnitude, a different kind, and yet still very much tangible. The discovery of God lies in the daily and the ordinary, not in the spectacular and the heroic. If we can't find God in the routines of life and home and shop and school and driving and mowing our grass and all the other stuff we do, we can't find him there. We're not going to find him anywhere. Thomas Merton urges us to have an unspeakable reverence for the holiness of created things, to celebrate the creation and to see God in it. Do you ever stop to contemplate the fact that Jesus spent most of his earthly life in a very ordinary blue-collar job? He was a carpenter. Now, probably what that actually means, when we think about carpenters, we think about people who build houses. Well, in first century Palestine, there wasn't enough wood to build houses out of wood. Houses were made out of stone, out of mud brick. They weren't made out of wood. You might have a wood door frame or a wooden door, but carpenters were people who were woodworkers. They made things out of wood. They made furniture. They made tools. They made handles. These were people who worked, for the most part, not out building a house, but in a shop with some very basic tools in which they shaped wood into useful items. But it was still a blue-collar job. It was skilled labor. But it was somebody, he was someone who made his living, who earned his bread working with his hands at skilled labor. Now, do you think that the day Jesus put down his plane and his awl and his other ancient tools and started out the life of an itinerant preacher, that he suddenly, at age 30 approximately, became spiritual? Well, that's laughable. Of course not. So, for the vast majority of his life on earth, he lived an intensely spiritual life in the midst of the ordinary. Nothing he did in that entire span, except for one trip to Jerusalem at the age of 12, was regarded as noteworthy enough to even include it in the Gospels. So Jesus discovered and lived out for most of his life an intensely spiritual life, a life that was prepared him for the most amazing ministry in all of history. He had no college, no seminary. He undoubtedly went to synagogue school, just like any well-brought-up boy of that age would have been, where he would have learned to read he learned Hebrew and learned to read the Torah and memorize huge amounts of the law and the writings. But that was his formal education. And all the rest of the preparation that was necessary before he began his public ministry, he learned in living life, in celebrating the ordinary. You contrast that to the way most people think today, and they think about their job as a hindrance to prayer. If only I had some free time without the distractions of work. The answer to that is our vocation is an asset to prayer, because our work can become a prayer of action. We pray by offering up the work we do to God. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:31? Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Now, if we take that message to heart, if we really internalize that, then whatever we're doing as a prayer. We are doing it to honor God. We are doing it to glorify Him and to expand His kingdom. Richard Foster tells a story about early in his life. When he was a teenager, he got to spend the summer working with the Eskimo people up in northern Alaska. And he got to meet some of the Eskimo Christians in this town. And they had a deep sense of the wholeness of life. Everything they did was a part of their prayer and spiritual life. He was there to help build the first high school north of the Arctic Circle. So he's way, way up in the northwest part of Alaska, well north of the timberline, up in the tundra. And what he found out was that this was not particularly romantic work, it was just backbreaking hard work. And one of the more difficult tasks he got, one day he found himself having to dig a trench for a sewer line. Problem is, the ground was frozen. Now, digging is hard work under the best of circumstances. Digging frozen ground is kind of like picking rock. And an Eskimo man, whom he describes as having a face and hands of leathery toughness that reflected all the years he'd lived in that harsh climate, stopped by to watch him for a while. And he finally said, "You are digging a ditch to the glory of God." And it changed his whole outlook on that ditch he was digging. He was doing, now that it was in his conscious mind, exactly what Paul had admonished. Whatever you do, do it for the glory of God. Now, instead of just drudgery, he was digging a ditch that would glorify God. One writer says, prayer makes sense only if it's lived. One of a movie I particularly enjoy, and it's timely right now with the Olympics going on, is Chariots of Fire. And one of the reasons that I enjoy the movie so much is the character of Eric Liddell, who was a gold medalist Olympiad and went on to have an incredible ministry as a missionary to China, where he died after the communists took over. And in one of the great lines in that movie, he's having this conversation with his sister Jenny, and she's opposed to what he's doing. She sees his running as a distraction from his calling as a missionary, and she's wanting him to give it up and focus on his studies so he can get back to China. And he says to her, "Jenny, when I run, I feel his pleasure." For Eric, his running was something he did for the glory of God. And if you've seen the movie, and if you haven't, you really need to watch it. There is this dramatic scene, and it was true to the actual story of this man's life, where after he got to the Olympics, he found out that there was going to be a heat on Sunday, and as a part of his religious devotion, he didn't run on Sunday. That was playing games on the Lord's Day. And he had a strong feeling about that, and it became a national crisis and made headlines all around the world. Because what he was doing, if he could not do his running for God's glory, then he could not run at all. And to run on Sunday for him, he had scruples about this. It would have been a violation of a fundamental religious principle. That is taking something as ordinary as running a race and making it a prayer. Whether you are a novelist or an Olympic athlete or an electrician, or whether you clean toilets for a living, It is to be done as a prayer for God. Now, that gets kind of hard for some of us. Now, it's easy to imagine a Michelangelo painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He's a painter by trade, and doing what he's doing for the glory of God, because after all, he created these incredible frescoes that, make scenes from the Bible jump to life. It's easy to imagine a novelist who is a Christian doing their work for the glory of God and weaving powerful spiritual themes into the storyline. It's a little tough, though, when you start thinking about a janitor cleaning toilets for a living, doing it for the glory of God. And I can speak from personal experience here, because I worked my way through college and seminary doing just that. Particularly in college, I was the chief janitor at the field house at Southwest Baptist College. Being chief janitor is not a particularly lofty title, I can tell you that, right? And, a field house, it's, where they had the big basketball games. And in the front end of the building, there were two huge restrooms, one with men, one with women. And they all required a lot of cleaning. And I got quite proficient at it. I could go into one of those big things and I could have it sterilized, steaming, in less than 15 minutes. I had it down cold. You would not want me cleaning your bathroom the way I went about it, though. I can tell you that. There was a lot of water being splashed, but there was tile all the way to the roof. I didn't have to worry about damaging anything with my hot water and my strong cleaners. But when it was done, it looked clean, it smelled clean, because it was clean. Now, I won't go so far as to say that I was praying in my work, but I was moving in that direction because there was a pride of the job well done, which is sort of moving in the direction of letting your work be a prayer. If you can't take pride in the job, and I'm not talking about sinful pride, I'm just simply saying this is a job that needs to be done, I'm going to do the best I can with it. That's moving in the direction of making your work a prayer. The next step is to be conscious of the fact that what you're doing either reflects well or reflects poorly on God. And if it reflects well, then it is indeed a prayer. There are few things that upset me more than somebody who makes a point of identifying themselves publicly as a Christian and then conducting themselves in a way that brings shame to the cause of Christ. If you're a car salesman and you're deceptive in your selling techniques, and people know that you're a deacon at Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church, and they feel like you've just cheated them on a car, well, they're not only going to be unhappy with you as a car salesman, they're not only going to be unhappy with the business where you work, they're going to think less of Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church and ultimately the kingdom of God, especially if they're not Christians. So you can make your job a prayer, or you can make it a shame. Remember, work was not the curse. Work was a gift from God before there was a curse. The curse took work and made it into toil. But work in itself is a good thing. Every action performed in the sight of God because it is the will of God and in a manner that God wills is a prayer. Often a better prayer than we could utter with words. Life is filled with the ordinary, and a big part of it sometimes is waiting. Now, confession time. And I have a witness that can testify to this. Waiting is not one of the things I do real well. I like to be active. It can be a tedious job, but just sitting and doing nothing is something that I don't thrive at. But even in those times of enforced waiting, if we are willing to give it to God, He can bless it. Sometimes He forces us to wait because He needs to slow us down enough that He can get our attention. Because we go through life at such a speed. Do you ever have the experience of driving down a familiar road, a road you've been down many, many times, and happening to look out the window and realize that there was a house or a sign or some other object that you'd never noticed before and you'd been by it many, many times? Been there all along. It was a new arrival. You just never seen it. Now, when you're driving a car, you've got an excuse for that. You're going to be focused on the road. But it always kind of throws me when I'm going along and I realize, I never noticed that house before, or that tree, or whatever it is. Because, particularly if it's a familiar road, like that drive I make into the office every morning, because it is so familiar, we tend to not even see what we're driving by. Sometimes the rate at which we move through life deprives us of the ability to see. Time or two I've had the unhappy experience of having a car break down on a familiar road and having to get out and walk for help. And it's always very instructive when you have to do that, because you suddenly realize that what you always perceived in your mind as a very short distance is in fact a long ways when you have to hoof it. And that grade that you never thought about as being particularly steep suddenly seems like Mount Everest when you're having to walk up it. But sometimes God has to do those kind of things to get our attention, to teach us something we need to know. At the very heart of prayer, and particularly the heart of this outward focused prayer, is petitionary prayer. This is most of what prayer is about. In the way we live our lives, in the way we do prayer, and in the way prayer is described in the Bible. Do you know why the God who created the universe chooses to answer our prayers? Because we are His children and we ask. God delights in our asking. He is pleased at our asking. His heart is warmed by our asking. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great 19th century preacher, once said, "Whether we like it or not, asking is the rule of the kingdom." It's right at the very heart of what it is to be a Christian. We are about the business of asking God for things. When our asking is for ourselves, we call it petition. When it's on behalf of others, we call it intercession. In either event, it's asking. And that is the heart of both experiences. Some people with a false sense of spiritual superiority kind of talk down about the subject of petitionary prayer. If you were really mature in your spiritual life, if your prayer life was just simply at a higher level, then you'd be focusing your time on praise and adoration and meditation and contemplation, something as crass and as venial as asking God for stuff. you would have outgrown that if you're just a little more mature. Well, it's a very false position to take. It's not very biblical either. In fact, it's quite unbiblical. Petitionary prayer will always remain at the heart of our prayer life because we are always forever dependent utterly upon God. The fact that we do petitionary prayer is a daily reminder of our utter dependence on Him for the very air we breathe. And to think that we would ever outgrow that would be like thinking we'd outgrow breathing. It is making the incredibly false and ultimately heretical statement that we don't need God. In fact, in the Hebrew and Greek words that are typically used for prayer, they literally mean to request or to make a petition. That is what prayer is. And the Bible is full of petitionary prayer, and it makes no apology for it. Now, I recognize that often our petitions seem immature and self-absorbed, and some of them are. One writer suggests the petitions that are less than pure can only be purified by petition. The only way you can pray your way out of immature praying is by praying. Petition is not a lower form of prayer. It is the staple of the diet. This is the meat and potatoes, the basic protein and starch of your prayer life. Sure, sometimes we, if we're fortunate, can lift our prayers into rapturous, joyous levels of pure praise and adoration. But that's not where we live our prayer life. And that is not a better kind of prayer. It is a different kind of prayer. There is not a hierarchy of prayer. Different kinds of prayer serve different needs. And petition is what Jesus taught us when He taught us how to pray. There are some common problems with petitionary prayer. First is a very reasonable question that we ask: why should we have to ask God for stuff when He already knows what we need? What's more, He already knows if we're going to ask. So why do I ask, give me this day my daily bread, when I already know that He wants me to have my daily bread? I already know that He already knows I'm going to ask for it. So why go through that exercise? Well, the simplest, most straightforward answer is because God likes to be asked. As parents, as grandparents, we know what that means. We don't like to be taken advantage of. We don't like to be presumed upon. We like to be asked. And usually we're delighted to say yes. But if only to have the conversation, we like to be asked. The fact that God is all-knowing and omniscient, as we say, also does not preclude His withholding judgment on matters, on decisions, depending on the give and take of the relationship. In other words, there are some things that God may not give us unless we ask, even though He would like to give it to us, even though it would please Him to give, even though it would be in our best interest to have it. It is altogether possible that there are some things He will simply withhold until we ask. And then there are the people who say, well, I really don't want to bother God with petty details of my life. I mean, he's got a universe to run. Why should he care whether or not I can find that shirt I need on sale at Kohl's? But think about the relationship that Jesus sets forth as the model for our relationship with God. A relationship in which we say to him, Abba, Father. Now, I have heard it said, in fact, I have probably said it myself, that this is kind of the Aramaic equivalent of calling God Daddy. That's not quite accurate. Daddy has not just a diminutive sense, but a childish connotation to it. What is probably closer, still not perfect, because when you go from one language to another, you never get perfect meshes, would be the word I use to refer to my father, Dad. That carries with it intimacy and respect. At my age, particularly as a male, if I were to refer to my father as Daddy, he'd look at me like I'd been hit on the head. Maybe my sister could get away with that, but not me. But he would expect me to call him Dad. And if I needed anything, all I would have to do is pick up the phone and say, Dad, I need your help. And he'd move heaven and earth to do it. God is interested in the petty little details of our life. And he is not ever overwhelmed by his responsibilities as God. He doesn't need time off from being God. You don't have to make an appointment ahead of time to get his attention. The biggest problem that most of us have with petitionary prayer is unanswered prayers. And every single one of us have experienced them. Now, first caution is don't glibly write this off too quickly. The most common glib response is sometimes God says yes, sometimes God says no, sometimes God says maybe, sometimes God says wait. And just because you didn't get the answer you expected doesn't mean he didn't answer. Well, frankly, if my prayer is about getting a shirt on sale at Kohl's, that excuse I can live with. If it's whether or not the recurrence of prostate cancer that my father is dealing with is going to be quickly controlled or not, that's not an answer that's going to satisfy me. I need something with more meat on it than that. If we are honest and not just trying to cover up our own insecurities and our own weak faith, we must all admit to very perplexing, deep perplexity over unanswered prayer. C.S. Lewis put it this way: every war, every famine or plague, almost every deathbed is the monument to a petition that was not granted. What do you do with that? The problem only gets worse when you look at Scripture. When you look at the lavish promises to answered prayer in the New Testament, especially the very words of Jesus. I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. If you've got a red letter printed Bible, those words are in red. The first thing we have to do is confess we have a genuine, not an imaginary problem here. I don't know why the heartfelt petition of a terminally ill person or a homeless person sometimes seems to go unanswered. I wish it was some other way. That's reality. I have experienced that dilemma individually. I have experienced it as a pastor leading the church. You know, most of you, maybe all of you, were present when I gathered the entire congregation for a special time of prayer for Sharon Bolson. We poured out our hearts to God on her behalf. And 6 months later, she was dead. What did we do wrong? Was there some part of the formula that we forgot to quote? Were we so sinful a congregation that God wasn't hearing us? You know, these are real questions that people really struggle with. Part of the problem is our vantage point. We see things from what is ultimately a very narrow, limited perspective. I've been on this earth for a little over 62 and a half years. 50 some of those I can remember well. When you look at the span of human history, I've got a very little slice of it, even at that age. I don't have God's perspective on the movement of time. And when I look into the future, I don't have any perspective at all. Whereas God can see as far into the future as he can see into the past. So my perspective is very limited. One writer talking about this observes, "We shall come one day to a heaven where we shall gratefully know that God's great refusals were sometimes the true answer to our truest prayers." That's worth hearing again. We shall come one day to a heaven where we shall gratefully know that God's great refusals were sometimes the true answers to our truest prayers. God sees things that we can't begin to perceive. There are times when our prayers are simply self-contradictory, where we're asking something that's impossible, like, grant me patience quickly. You can't get it that way. It's like the false analogy is, can God make a rock bigger than he can pick up? Some things are absurd by definition. And some of our prayers are simply absurd. There's no way that even the God of the creator of the universe could answer some of our prayers. Because in what we think is the answer, there's a logical absurdity. There are some prayers that we are not prepared to have answered. We think we are. But if he were to give us what we were asking for, it would overwhelm us. Imagine a 10-year-old boy who wants to immediately be able to win an Olympic gold medal in track and field. If God gave him the answer to that prayer, it would overwhelm him. He would not be able to handle the answer. Sometimes we couldn't handle what might come if our request were granted. Like the person who spent all their life in poverty and they suddenly win the jackpot to the lottery. And what seems like a wonderful thing within a few months leads to disaster because they're not able to handle what's suddenly been thrust upon them. Or the young athlete who gets into all kinds of trouble because of the sudden fame and money that comes with his position. Again, C.S. Lewis says, if God had granted all the silly prayers I've made in my life, where would I be now? Many times our prayers are indeed answered, but we lack the eyes to see it. We miss the deeper intent of our own prayers. And so God has answered it, but we don't have the perception to realize that we are indeed seeing the answer. We have to recognize how little we understand the ways and the timing of God. Remember what James and John wanted to do to the Samaritan village? We want to bring down, God called down fire and brimstone on them. Rain fire from heaven upon our enemies. Of course, God's enemies are always our enemies. That works out real convenient for us. Joyce gets annoyed at one of my fidgety habits. Do it all the time. She, after 40 plus years of marriage, she thinks that this is my sign that I'm annoyed with her slow pace. It's just nervous energy. Sometimes our finger tapping is an anxiety because our timing is out of sync with God's timing. God is incredibly patient in His mercy. I mean, I just have to spend 5 minutes looking at the headlines on my computer, and I'm with John and James. Lord, bring on the brimstone. These people deserve it. There's a reason why I'm not God. There's a really good reason. When I look at some of these things like ISIS, I have to admit, if I was God, the ISIS problem would be gone tomorrow. The fact is, God loves those people just as much as He loves me, and He is patiently trying to bring them to Him. We have to remember that in our petitionary prayers, we are not neutral parties. We come into the thing with a huge bias. And that blinds us to certain realities. It may be that the prayer we are asking, the real answer to it is a very uncomfortable change that needs to be made in our own lives. But we're not ready to ask for that. We want the problem to be solved, but we don't want to deal with the root of the problem. And so sometimes God's answer is not at all what we expected, but it's in our long-term best interest. And then there is one other problem about unanswered prayers. I don't want to hit this too hard because it is by no means always the case. But sometimes sin, our sin, is what hinders our prayer life. Now, I'm not saying that God never hears a sinner's prayer. If that were the case, we'd all be lost. Certainly God hears the prayers of sinners. But by its very nature, our sin separates us from God. It ruptures the intimacy of the fellowship that we seek and need. It dulls our spiritual sensitivities. We become nearsighted and develop thick eardrums. And so we can't hear or see God at work. We cannot discern the heart of God. And when we ask for the wrong things. The sin It's not that because of our sin, God quits listening or God quits answering. It's because of our sin, we quit hearing, we quit seeing, and we lose sight of how to ask what we need to ask. The problem with sin is not God. The problem with sin is us. For sheer power and majesty, there is no prayer the equal of our Father. The Pater Noster, as it's called. Matthew 6:19 through 13. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. In that prayer, we have total prayer represented. Jesus covers every aspect of prayer in that simple prayer. And it is essentially petitionary prayer. It is asking. There are three entreaties, if you would, that can be gathered up in three words from that prayer. Give, forgive, and deliver. The prayer starts out in a way that nobody would have predicted. Give us this day our daily bread. Now, if we were going to teach somebody simple step-by-step on how to pray, the petition part comes later. We start out with adoration and confession. Then we get to thanksgiving. Then finally, supplication. Remember the ACTS formula. Adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication right on the end. But that's not how Jesus taught. I mean, there is a brief acknowledgement of God, a brief adoration. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is. But very quickly, he gets to give us this day our daily bread. Before we deal with forgiveness, we got our hand out. When we have not forgiven our enemies, we've got our hand out. And Jesus says that's okay. It may be that it is only when we are conscious of our debt to God, as he grants us our daily bread, that we have the spiritual resources to recognize our need to forgive those who have a debt to us. And finally, there is deliver. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. A negative and a positive part to this. How could God be leading us into temptation? What's he talking about here? Well, there's only one time. The word is better translated trial. Lead us not into trial, into hard testing. And there's only one circumstance in which God deliberately leads us into a time of hard testing. And that's when there is something in our heart that needs to be revealed. Think about Judas. Judas was a man who had a problem with money. He liked it too much. He was inclined to steal. So, what did Jesus do? Was he foolish in giving the money bag, the treasury of the apostles, into the hands of a guy who had sticky fingers? Did Jesus not realize what he was doing? Well, if we believe Jesus was the Son of God with divine insight, obviously Jesus knew what he was doing. He was testing Judas. He was putting him deliberately into a situation where he was going to undergo a trial that would tempt him to follow those evil inclinations. Judas needed to be tested. He needed to endure and overcome that temptation. Jesus made him treasure on purpose, so that what was in Judas's heart that needed to be revealed would be revealed. Therefore, the prayer, lead us not into temptation, means, Lord, may there be nothing in me that will force you to put me to the test in order to reveal what's in my heart. This is a matter of discipleship. May my heart be clean enough that you don't have to resort to putting me to that kind of a trial. That's what that prayer is asking. And we're not talking about what Martin Luther referred to as puppy sins. We're talking about nasty grown-up kind of sins. The adult sins that we have to deal with every day. He then says, deliver us from evil. As much as we'd like it otherwise, the original text is quite clear. Jesus is urging us to pray for rescue, not from some generic evil, but from a very personal evil, the evil one, Satan. Peter said Satan's like a hungry lion, seeking somebody to devour. Now, again, C.S. Lewis talks about the fact there's two errors you can make when you're dealing with the demonic. To paraphrase, think too little about it or think too much about it. There are those Christians who get so fixated on this that they're, exorcising spooks from every corner of the room. I don't have much patience with that. But the other error is every bit as bad, if not worse, and that is to blow this off as superstitious stuff that is a holdover from another era. The Bible is quite explicit about the reality of an intelligent, malicious, malevolent, spiritual force bent on evil. We call him Satan, the adversary, and that's exactly what he is. And Jesus says you need to pray for protection because you got an enemy there that you can't whoop on your own. He's too big, he's too mean, he's too powerful. He can't resist Jesus for a second, but he can make our life absolute misery. One Cambridge professor put it this way: if prayer is at the heart of religion, then petition is at the heart of prayer. And next week, we will deal with the other piece of this intercession.